some words once spoken echo through time until they find their way home. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in Marcus Washington's cramped Philadelphia office as sleet hammered against the windows on this bitter February night in 2021. 50 years of private investigation work had taught him that coincidences were usually conspiracies in disguise, but the manila folder spread across his desk defied every logical explanation he possessed. 5 photographs of dead men stared back at him, each one a face he recognized from that suffocating back room beneath Madison Square Garden in 1971, each one found with an identical handwritten note containing words that should have died with Muhammad Ali himself. Marcus's arthritic fingers trembled as he reached for his coffee, remembering how Ali's voice had dropped to a whisper that March night after Frazier's cruel joke about his mother. As a young federal agent, Marcus had been investigating fight fixing, but what he witnessed in those frozen seconds changed everything he thought he knew about fear, about power, and about the weight of words that cut deeper than any punch ever could. The storm outside matched the chaos in his mind as he realized he might be the last living witness to whatever curse Ali had spoken. And someone was systematically eliminating everyone who heard it. But who could possibly know what was said in that room? And why were they killing to keep it buried? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus pushed back from his desk, the old leather chair creaking like his joints in the cold. The 5 photographs seemed to mock him in the stuttering fluorescent light. Harvey Goldman, the Arena Commission inspector, Tommy Brick Morelli, Frazier's cut man, William Hayes, the sports writer from the Philadelphia Inquirer, Carl Jennings, the television producer, and just last week, Father Anthony Russo, the priest who'd somehow talked his way into that back room claiming he was there to bless the fighters. All dead within 12 months. All found with the same note. Marcus rubbed his eyes, feeling every one of his 73 years settling into his bones. His office hadn't changed much since 1995 when he'd hung up his federal badge and opened Washington investigations. Same water-stained ceiling tiles, same mismatched filing cabinets, same view of the parking lot behind Chen's Chinese restaurant. But tonight, surrounded by these ghosts from his past, the familiar space felt foreign, contaminated. He walked to the window, watching ice crystals form intricate patterns on the glass. Across the street, the neon sign of Murphy's Tavern flickered erratically, casting red shadows that reminded him of the emergency exit light in that underground room 50 years ago. He'd been 23 then, fresh out of Quantico, assigned to investigate unusual betting patterns that suggested the fight of the century might be rigged. Such a simple assignment. Follow the money, document the players, file the report. Instead, he'd stumbled into something that defied every category in the Bureau's handbook. The memory surfaced unbidden. The acrid smell of cigarette smoke mixing with liniment and fierce sweat. The way the concrete walls seemed to close in as tension filled the room like poison gas. Frazier had been riding high, cocky in his undefeated streak. And when someone mentioned Ali's mother, Odessa Clay, who'd passed just months before, Joe had laughed. That cruel, cutting laugh that preceded words designed to wound. Marcus could still see Ali's face in that moment, the way his features shifted from surprise to something far more dangerous. The room had fallen silent except for the distant roar of the crowd upstairs and the hum of ancient electrical systems. When Ali finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that seemed to press down on everyone present, forcing them into their chairs like gravity had suddenly doubled. The phone rang, jarring Marcus back to the present. He glanced at the caller ID, block number. At 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night, that could only mean one thing in his line of work: Washington investigations. Heavy breathing filled the line, followed by the scratch of what might have been a pencil on paper. Then, in a voice distorted by either electronics or terror, came the words that turned Marcus's blood to ice water. The sins of the fathers shall visit the sons, but the words of the righteous shall visit the guilty until justice walks among the living once more. The line went dead. Marcus dropped the phone, his hand shaking so violently he knocked over his coffee mug. The dark liquid spread across his desk, seeping into case files and soaking the edges of the 5 photographs. but he barely noticed because those were the exact words, Muhammad Ali's words, that had frozen that room in 1971, word for word, inflection for inflection, as if Ali himself had just spoken them. But Muhammad Ali had been dead for nearly 5 years. Marcus grabbed paper towels from his desk drawer, frantically trying to save the files from the spreading coffee. As he lifted Harvey Goldman's photograph, he noticed something he'd missed before, a small mark in the corner, barely visible, a tiny drawing of a butterfly. He checked the other photos. Tommy Morelli's had a bee. William Hayes showed what looked like a glove. Carl Jennings bore the outline of a crown, and Father Rousseau's photograph had a small, carefully drawn mosque. Symbols, a pattern within the pattern. Marcus sank back into his chair, his mind racing. Someone wasn't just killing the witnesses, they were leaving a trail of breadcrumbs, practically begging to be followed. But breadcrumbs had a way of leading to places you didn't want to go, and trails often ended with the hunter becoming the hunted. Outside, the storm intensified, turning the parking lot into a sheet of ice. The temperature was dropping, and according to the weather report he'd heard earlier, this was just the beginning. A massive system was moving in from the west, promising to dump 2 feet of snow on Philadelphia before the weekend. Marcus looked at the photographs again, now stained with coffee but still accusatory in their silence. 5 men dead, 1 voice from beyond the grave. And somewhere in this frozen city, someone who knew things they shouldn't know was playing a game with rules Marcus didn't understand. But he'd been playing dangerous games for 50 years, and he was still breathing. That had to count for something. He reached for his coat. If someone wanted to dance with ghosts, Marcus Washington would teach them the steps, even if it killed him. The ordinary world. Marcus sat in his car outside Murphy's Tavern for 20 minutes, engine running, watching shadows move behind frosted windows. The red neon sign cast bloody streaks across fresh snow, and every time someone pushed through the tavern door, he tensed. But none of the bundled figures emerging into the bitter night were the one he feared might appear. The phone call had rattled him more than he cared to admit. In his 30 years as a private investigator, Marcus had received his share of threatening calls, angry husbands, exposed cheats, criminals he'd helped put away. But this was different. This reached back through 5 decades to touch something he'd buried so deep he'd almost convinced himself it never happened. He pulled away from the curb, navigating slowly through streets already treacherous with black ice. His apartment was only 6 blocks from his office, but tonight those blocks felt like miles. The storm was picking up momentum, and the few other cars on the road crept along like wounded animals seeking shelter. Home was the 3rd floor of a converted brownstone in Northern Liberties, the same building where he'd lived since leaving the bureau. Mrs. Chen, no relation to the restaurant owner, had been his landlord for 26 years, and at 81, she still climbed 3 flights of stairs every Tuesday to collect his rent in person. She claimed it was for the exercise, but Marcus suspected she enjoyed their weekly conversations about everything except what he actually did for a living. He climbed the narrow staircase, each step creaking a familiar tune. The hallway smelled of Mrs. Chen's cooking and the lavender sachets she hung from the light fixtures. Normal smells, safe smells. Nothing like the stale fear and cigarette smoke that had haunted his dreams for half a century. His apartment was spartanly furnished. A worn leather sofa facing a television he rarely watched, a kitchen table that doubled as his home office, bookshelves lined with true crime novels and boxing biographies he'd never finished. On the mantelpiece above a gas fireplace that worked sporadically sat 3 photographs: his parents on their wedding day, his daughter Rachel at her college graduation, and his grandson Tommy hitting a home run in Little League last summer. Marcus poured himself 3 fingers of bourbon and settled into his armchair, the one luxury he'd allowed himself after his divorce 15 years ago. The leather was soft as butter, broken in by countless nights when sleep wouldn't come, and whiskey was the only thing that quieted the voices from the past. He thought about Rachel, probably asleep in her house in Cherry Hill with her husband and 2 kids. She called every Sunday, religiously, trying to bridge the gap that had opened between them after her mother left. Rachel thought he worked too much, lived too alone, held too tightly to things that should be forgotten. She wasn't wrong, but she wasn't right either. Some things couldn't be forgotten because forgetting them would be worse than remembering. His phone buzzed. A text from his grandson, "Grandpa, can you come to my game Saturday? We're playing for the championship." Saturday. 3 days from now. Marcus had promised himself he'd never miss another one of Tommy's games. Not after missing the first 5 years, because he was too buried in his work to remember what mattered. The boy was 11 now, the same age Marcus had been when his own father disappeared into a bottle and never climbed back out. He typed back, "Wouldn't miss it for the world, slugger." The lie came easily. By Saturday, if his instincts were right, he might be dead or running for his life. But 11-year-old boys didn't need to know that their grandfathers sometimes carried secrets that could kill them. Marcus walked to his bedroom window and looked down at the street. A lone figure stood under the streetlight across from his building, barely visible through the swirling snow. The figure was too far away to make out details, but something about the way they stood, perfectly still, as if immune to the cold, made Marcus's skin crawl. He watched for 10 minutes. The figure never moved, never shifted weight, never showed any sign of being human rather than statue. When a city snowplow rumbled down the street, its headlights briefly illuminated the space under the streetlight. It was empty. Marcus closed the curtains and double-checked the locks on his door. In the kitchen, he opened the cabinet above the refrigerator and pulled out a .38 Smith & Wesson he hadn't touched in 6 months. The weight felt familiar in his hands, comforting in the way that tools of survival always were to men who'd spent their lives dancing on the edge of violence. He cleaned the gun methodically, muscle memory guiding his hands, while his mind wandered to Rachel and Tommy and Mrs. Chen and all the ordinary precious things that made life worth protecting. Tomorrow he'd start hunting whoever was playing games with ghosts, but tonight he allowed himself to pretend he was just an aging man in an old apartment, listening to the storm rage outside while the city slept. But even as he told himself that lie, Marcus knew the ordinary world was already slipping away. Marcus set the cleaned gun on his kitchen table and tried to convince himself he could sleep. The bourbon had settled into his bones, and exhaustion pulled at him like an anchor, but every time he closed his eyes, he heard that distorted voice repeating Ali's words. "The sins of the fathers shall visit the sons, but the words of the righteous shall visit the guilty, until justice walks among the living once more." He was reaching for the light switch when his phone rang again. This time the caller ID showed a name, Rachel. Marcus's blood went cold. His daughter never called after 10 o'clock unless something was wrong. He snatched up the phone, already imagining car accidents, home invasions, any of the 1,000 disasters that plagued a father's nightmares. "Rachel? What's wrong?" "Dad?" Her voice was strange, tight with fear but trying to stay controlled. "I'm sorry to call so late, but something really weird just happened." Marcus gripped the phone tighter. "Are you all right? Are the kids okay?" "We're fine, we're all fine. But Dad, a man just came to my door. He said he was looking for you, that he had something important to tell you about your old work. When I told him you didn't live here, he just smiled, and he asked about Tommy." The room seemed to tilt. Marcus sat down hard in his kitchen chair, the .38 gleaming under the fluorescent light like an accusation. What did he look like? That's the thing. I can barely remember. Average height, maybe? Dark coat. But Dad, his voice. Rachel's breathing quickened. It sounded wrong, like he was speaking through some kind of machine or like his throat was damaged, and when he smiled, it didn't reach his eyes. Marcus was already moving, grabbing his coat with one hand while holding the phone with the other. "Listen to me carefully. I want you to pack bags for all of you right now. Take the kids and go to that hotel near your mother's place in Haddonfield. Don't use credit cards, I'll reimburse you for cash. And Rachel, don't tell anyone where you're going. Dad, you're scaring me. What's this about? What kind of old work? Just do it. Please." Marcus was pulling on his boots, the gun already tucked into his waistband. "I'll explain everything later, but right now I need you and the kids somewhere safe." A pause. Then Rachel's voice came back smaller, more like the little girl who used to climb into his lap after bad dreams. "Is this like before? Like why Mom left?" The question hit him like a physical blow. Sarah had left because she'd finally realized that Marcus carried darkness with him wherever he went. that some stains never washed out no matter how many years passed. She'd taken Rachel and moved across town, not far enough to punish him, but far enough to feel safe. "Yes," he said quietly. "It's like that. Okay, give me 30 minutes. Make it 20. Marcus ended the call and stood in his kitchen, feeling the last threads of his ordinary world snap like overtaxed cables. For 26 years, he'd lived in this apartment, built this careful distance between his past and present. He'd attended school plays and birthday parties, taught his grandson to throw a curveball, pretended to be just another aging man with an unremarkable job and normal regrets. But normal men didn't receive calls from dead boxing legends. Normal men didn't have mysterious visitors asking about their grandchildren. He walked to his bedroom closet and pushed aside hanging clothes to reveal a small safe he'd installed in 1995. Inside were things he'd hoped never to need again: fake identification documents, $10,000 in cash, and a manila folder containing photocopies of his original case files from 1971. The Bureau had classified the real files so deeply they might as well have been buried on the moon, but Marcus had kept his personal notes. As he pulled out the folder, a photograph fell to the floor. He'd forgotten it was there, a picture taken the night before the fight, showing the key players gathered in that underground room. Marcus stood in the background, trying to look like just another hanger-on while his FBI training cataloged every face, every gesture, every potential threat. But it was the foreground that stopped his breathing. There, caught in a moment between the camera's flash and history's judgment, stood Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier side by side. But they weren't alone. Behind them, partially obscured by shadow, was another figure. A man Marcus had somehow forgotten, or perhaps forced himself to forget. A man whose face, even 50 years later and blurred by time, looked remarkably similar to the description Rachel had just given him. Marcus stared at the photograph, his hands trembling. The man in the shadows wore the same dark coat, the same unsettling smile. But that was impossible. If this person had been an adult in 1971, he'd be in his 70s or 80s now. No one stayed frozen in time. Unless time wasn't the factor Marcus thought it was. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "The children are beautiful, just like their grandfather's secrets." Marcus grabbed his gun and ran for the door. Marcus burst through his apartment door and pounded down the 3 flights of stairs, taking them 2 at a time. His lungs burned in the frigid air as he crashed through the building's entrance into the storm. Snow whipped around him like frozen needles, and the wind cut through his coat as if it were paper. He fumbled for his car keys, his hands shaking, not from cold but from the terror that had been building in his chest since that photograph fell to his floor. The man in the shadows. After 50 years, how had he forgotten that face? How had his mind simply erased someone who'd been standing right there, witnessing everything? The engine turned over reluctantly in the bitter cold. As Marcus threw the car into drive, his phone rang. Rachel again. "Dad, we're leaving now, but—" "Don't talk," Marcus interrupted, pulling onto the empty street. "Just go. I'll call you when it's safe." "When will that be?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Marcus stared through the windshield at the wall of snow ahead, his wipers fighting a losing battle against the storm. When would it be safe? When the 5 dead men could testify about what they'd seen? When Muhammad Ali could rise from his grave to explain what his words really meant? When a 50-year-old secret finally finished destroying everyone it touched? "I don't know," he said finally. He heard Rachel's sharp intake of breath, then the sound of her husband's voice in the background asking what was wrong. Normal people asking normal questions about an abnormal situation that Marcus had dragged them into simply by loving them. "Dad, maybe you should call the police. If someone's threatening us—" "The police can't help." Marcus turned onto Broad Street, the windshield fogging from his rapid breathing. "This goes too deep, too far back. Then what are you going to do?" Marcus pulled over and sat in the idling car, watching snow accumulate on the hood. What was he going to do? For 30 years as a private investigator, he'd built his reputation on being the man who found answers when nobody else could. Missing persons, insurance fraud, cheating spouses, problems with solutions, puzzles with pieces that eventually fit together. But this wasn't a puzzle. This was a reckoning. He could run. pack his own bag, empty his bank accounts, and disappear into the vast anonymity of America. He'd done it before, leaving the Bureau in 1973 under circumstances he'd never fully explained to anyone, including himself. He could do it again. Except running meant abandoning Rachel and Tommy and Mrs. Chen and everyone else whose orbit he'd entered. The text message had made that clear. The children are beautiful. Whatever this was about, it wouldn't end with Marcus. It would follow his blood, his connections, everyone who mattered to him. "I'm going to end it," he said into the phone. "How?" Marcus stared at his reflection in the rearview mirror. At 67, he looked older than his years. Gray hair gone mostly white, deep lines carved by decades of carrying weight that wasn't meant for one man's shoulders. He looked like what he was, someone who'd spent half a century trying to outrun a single night. By going backward instead of forward, by finding out what really happened in that room. Dad, that was 50 years ago. Everyone involved is probably dead. I know. Marcus put the car back in drive, but someone else was there, someone I forgot about or made myself forget about. And that someone is very much alive. The truth settled on him like snow, cold, inevitable, and covering everything familiar until the landscape became foreign. For 50 years, he'd assumed he was the only living witness to Ali's words. He'd carried the secret alone, let it eat at him alone, convinced himself that his silence was protecting something greater than himself. But secrets didn't live in isolation. They grew in the spaces between people, feeding on connection and proximity. And someone else had been feeding this particular secret for 5 decades, keeping it alive, nurturing it into something that could reach across time and start killing. Marcus thought about the symbols on the photographs: butterfly, bee, glove, crown, mosque. A pattern he didn't understand, but that clearly meant something to someone. Breadcrumbs leading back to that underground room where everything went wrong. His phone buzzed with another text. Running won't help. Neither will hiding them. Some debts can only be paid in person. Marcus turned off his phone and drove into the storm. Behind him, his apartment building grew smaller in the rearview mirror, until it disappeared entirely, swallowed by the snow and darkness. Ahead lay nothing but empty streets and the kind of choices that changed everything. He'd spent 30 years building a wall between his past and present. Now someone was tearing it down brick by brick, and Marcus could either keep running from the collapse or turn around and face what he'd been hiding from. The storm raged around him, but inside the car, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: the terrible clarity that came just before stepping into the abyss. Marcus drove through the storm for 20 minutes before he realized he was heading toward the one place he'd sworn never to return to: Madison Square Garden. The current building wasn't the same structure that had housed the fight of the century, that had been torn down in the late 60s, but the new garden sat only blocks away, and beneath its foundations, some of the old infrastructure remained, including the maze of storage rooms, utility tunnels, and forgotten spaces where secrets had once been born. He pulled into a parking garage 6 blocks from the arena and sat listening to the engine tick as it cooled. The photograph from his safe lay on the passenger seat, that mysterious figure still lurking in the shadows behind Ali and Frazier. Marcus picked it up and studied it under the dome light, trying to force his memory to surrender what it had hidden for so long. The man's face was partially turned away, but there was something about his posture, the way he held his hands, that seemed familiar. Not from that night necessarily, but from somewhere else. Some other context that his mind refused to provide. Marcus's phone buzzed despite being turned off, somehow still receiving messages. This time the text contained only an address: 33rd and 8th, underground entrance, service tunnel B-7, come alone, or the boy learns what his grandfather really is. Tommy. They'd mentioned Tommy specifically now, not just the children. An 11-year-old kid who collected baseball cards and still believed his grandfather was some kind of hero, who had no idea that heroes were just broken people who'd learned to carry their damage quietly. Marcus checked his gun, chambered a round, and stepped out into the blizzard. The streets near the garden were deserted except for scattered homeless encampments huddled in doorways and under scaffolding. Steam rose from manholes like ghosts fleeing underground purgatory. Marcus pulled his coat tighter and walked toward the address he'd been given, each step taking him further from the careful life he'd constructed and deeper into the past he'd tried to bury. 33rd and 8th was a construction site. one of the endless development projects that transformed New York City block by block, erasing history in the name of progress. But behind the plywood barriers and warning signs, Marcus found what he was looking for: a rusted metal door marked with faded city utility symbols. Service tunnel B-7. He tried the handle. Unlocked. The tunnel beyond was older than the current garden, a remnant from the building's previous incarnation. Emergency lighting cast sickly yellow pools every 20 feet, creating a pathway that descended into darkness. The air smelled of rust and decades-old cigarette smoke, and somewhere in the distance, Marcus could hear the steady drip of water finding its way through cracked concrete. He moved forward carefully, the .38 drawn and ready. His footsteps echoed off tiled walls that belonged to another era, when this part of the city had been something different, when the underground spaces had served purposes he'd never bothered to learn. The tunnel curved left, then right, then opened into a wider chamber that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. He'd been here before. Not this exact room, but something very much like it. The same institutional green tiles, the same low ceiling with exposed pipes, the same arrangement of folding chairs around a central space. Someone had reconstructed it. Not perfectly, but close enough that Marcus felt the years collapse around him like a house of cards. "Welcome back, Agent Washington." The voice came from the shadows beyond the emergency lights, electronically distorted but somehow familiar. Marcus raised his gun toward the sound, his heart hammering against his ribs. "I haven't been Agent Washington for almost 50 years. Haven't you?" The voice moved, circling the room's perimeter just outside the light. "Once you take an oath, Marcus, it stays with you forever. Just like secrets, just like guilt. Who are you?" A figure stepped forward into the light, and Marcus felt reality shift underneath him. The man looked exactly like the photograph, not older, not changed by time, but identical. The same dark coat, the same unsettling smile, the same ageless quality that defied every law Marcus understood about how the world worked. "I was there that night," the man said, "when Ali spoke those words that changed everything, when Joe Frazier learned that some lines should never be crossed, when you first understood that truth and lies sometimes wear each other's faces." Marcus kept the gun trained on center mass, but his hand was shaking. "That's impossible. You'd have to be old, dead, gone." The man's smile widened. "Death is negotiable, Marcus. Time is flexible, and some debts compound interest across decades." The room seemed to spin around Marcus as he realized that everything he'd believed about that night, about the intervening years, about cause and effect, had been built on foundations that were crumbling beneath him. He wasn't just crossing a threshold into danger. He was stepping through a doorway into a world where the rules he'd lived by no longer applied. Marcus steadied his breathing, fighting the vertigo that threatened to drop him to his knees. The FBI had trained him to compartmentalize impossibilities, to focus on actionable intelligence even when the situation defied logic. But those training protocols assumed the world operated according to certain fundamental laws, that time moved forward, that people aged, that the dead stayed dead. "You're not real," Marcus said, though his voice lacked conviction. The man's laugh was like static electricity across broken glass. "Reality is a consensus, Agent Washington, and tonight the consensus is breaking down." Marcus noticed movement in his peripheral vision. Other figures emerged from the shadows, 5 of them, arranged around the room's perimeter like pieces on a game board. Each wore the same dark clothing. Each carried the same unsettling stillness that suggested they weren't entirely bound by normal physical limitations. "The photographer in Detroit," Marcus whispered, recognizing one of the figures. "You were there when Morrison died." "We've been everywhere, Marcus. Every death, every discovery, every moment you thought you were getting closer to the truth." The lead figure gestured to his companions. "We've been shepherding this story for 50 years, waiting for the right time to conclude it. Why now? Why not just leave it buried?" "Because secrets aren't meant to stay buried forever. They're meant to ferment, to gain power, to reach critical mass." The man stepped closer, and Marcus caught a scent like ozone and old leather. Ali's words that night, they weren't just an insult or a threat. They were a summoning, a calling card that echoed through dimensions most people never see. Marcus felt his rationality fragmenting, but he forced himself to stay focused. These things, whatever they were, had threatened his family. That was the only fact that mattered. What do you want from me? Complete the circle. You were the only federal witness to what happened that night, the only one who heard Ali's exact words and understood their significance. Your testimony makes it official. Your presence makes it real. One of the other figures moved, and Marcus caught sight of a familiar face, older than it should be, but unmistakably Jerry Malone, the boxing commissioner who'd supposedly died in the Miami hotel fire 6 months ago. Malone's eyes were empty sockets filled with shadow, but his mouth still worked. He tried to run too, Marcus, Malone said, his voice echoing from some impossible distance. Thought 47 years was long enough to wait. Thought we'd forgotten. We never forget, another figure added, and Marcus recognized the missing sports journalist from Chicago, Patrick Henley, whose body had never been found after he'd started investigating the same connections Marcus had discovered. We've been collecting testimonies, gathering witnesses, building toward this moment. Marcus backed toward the tunnel entrance, but found his path blocked by another figure who materialized from the darkness like smoke gaining substance. This one was younger, wearing modern clothes but carrying the same otherworldly presence. Fresh recruit, the lead figure explained. We're always growing, always adapting. Death is just another form of employment in our organization. What organization? What the hell are you? We're what happens when certain words are spoken at certain moments in certain places. When the right combination of pain, power, and publicity creates a resonance that tears holes in the fabric of things. The man's smile widened impossibly. Ali didn't just threaten Joe Frazier that night, Marcus. He opened a door, and we've been walking through it ever since. Marcus's mind raced through everything he'd learned in the past week. The symbols on the photographs, the methodical elimination of witnesses, the careful reconstruction of this underground room. Not random killings, but orchestrated events leading to this confrontation. You're not here to kill me, Marcus realized. You need me alive. Very good. You always were the smartest one in that room. The figure reached into his coat and withdrew something that made Marcus's blood freeze. A small digital recorder, sleek and modern. We need you to speak Ali's words, to repeat them exactly as he said them 50 years ago, to complete the incantation that will make our existence permanent instead of provisional. And if I refuse? The lead figure tilted his head toward one of his companions, who pulled out a cell phone and showed Marcus the screen. Live video feed from a car driving through the storm, Rachel's car, with his daughter at the wheel and Tommy visible in the back seat. Then we collect alternative testimonies. Children often have more flexible relationship with reality anyway, more receptive to impossible truths. Marcus felt rage building in his chest, hot and clean and familiar. The same fury that had sustained him through 3 years in Vietnam, through countless dangerous cases as a PI, through all the moments when normal fear would have paralyzed him. These things had made one critical error. They'd threatened his family. All right, Marcus said, lowering his gun slightly. I'll say the words, but first, I want to know exactly what happens when I do. The figures exchanged glances that seemed to communicate volumes. Show him, the leader said. Show him what we really are. The figure who had been Jerry Malone stepped forward, his empty eye sockets beginning to glow with a sickly phosphorescent light. As Marcus watched in horror, the man's skin started to peel away in strips, not like flesh decaying, but like old wallpaper curling off a wall. Beneath was something that hurt to look at directly. Geometric patterns that shifted and writhed, angles that seemed to exist in more dimensions than should be possible. We are what words become when they carry enough weight, the lead figure explained, his own form beginning to shimmer and distort. When Muhammad Ali spoke that night, when he reached into the deepest well of his pain and fury and pulled up something that should have stayed buried, he didn't just curse Joe Frazier, he created us. Marcus forced himself to keep watching as the other figures began their own transformations. The missing journalist's face split open like a flower, revealing layers of text, newspaper headlines, boxing statistics, interview transcripts, all swirling together in a nauseating kaleidoscope. The fresh recruit's modern clothes dissolved into shadow, leaving behind something that looked like a living ink stain with too many limbs. Every word has power, the leader continued, his voice now coming from multiple directions at once. But some words, spoken in the right place, at the right moment, with the right amount of anguish, they tear holes. They make things possible that shouldn't be possible. Marcus felt his sanity straining against what he was seeing, but he forced himself to think tactically. These entities needed something from him. That gave him leverage, even if he didn't fully understand the game being played. The other witnesses, Marcus said, the ones you killed, why didn't their testimony work? The leader's form had become something like a man-shaped constellation, points of light connected by lines that traced patterns Marcus's brain refused to process. They only heard the words. You felt them. You were investigating, probing, trying to understand the connections even before Ali spoke. When those syllables hit the air, your mind was already open, already searching for meaning. That's why it took you 50 years to find me. Finding you was never the problem. We've always known where you were. The entity gestured, and Marcus saw his own life playing out in the shifting patterns of its form, his discharge from the FBI, his years as a private investigator, his daughter's wedding, his grandson's birth. We needed you to find us, to want answers badly enough that you'd come here willingly. Marcus realized with growing dread that everything, the photographs appearing in his cold cases, the mysterious deaths, even the storm tonight, had been carefully orchestrated to bring him to this moment. He hadn't been investigating, he'd been herded. The digital recorder materialized in the lead entity's shifting appendages, its red record light blinking patiently. Around the room, the other creatures arranged themselves in the same positions they'd occupied 50 years ago, when they'd still been human. The words, Marcus, the leader said. Speak Ali's exact words, and we become permanent, real in all dimensions, not just the spaces between moments. Refuse, and we collect what we need from your family instead. Marcus looked at the phone screen still displaying the live feed of Rachel's car. His daughter was gripping the steering wheel tightly, navigating through the blizzard with Tommy asleep in the back seat. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that their existence hung in the balance of a decision made by forces they couldn't comprehend. But as Marcus stared at that screen, something caught his attention. The timestamp in the corner wasn't showing the current time. It was cycling through dates, jumping erratically between past and future. The image itself flickered occasionally, revealing glimpses of other scenes, an empty car on a sunny day, a different woman driving, people who might have been Rachel and Tommy, or might have been strangers wearing their faces. You're lying, Marcus said suddenly. This isn't live feed. You're showing me possibilities, probabilities. You don't actually have them. The entity's forms wavered, their careful choreography disrupting for just a moment. In that brief slip, Marcus caught sight of something crucial, fear. These creatures, whatever they were afraid, not of him, but of what would happen if their plan failed. You're running out of time, Marcus continued, pieces clicking into place. 50 years was some kind of deadline, wasn't it? And it's almost up. The lead entity's voice carried a new edge of desperation. The words, Marcus, now, but Marcus was already moving, diving toward the tunnel entrance as the creatures surged toward him. He had seen their weakness now, felt the cracks in their carefully constructed reality. The real confrontation was just beginning. Marcus hit the tunnel floor hard as impossible geometries crashed into the space where he'd been standing. The entity's forms were unraveling, their careful human disguises shredding away to reveal the writhing chaos beneath. Behind him, the reconstructed room dissolved into fragments, pieces of memory and nightmare bleeding together like watercolors in rain. He rolled to his feet and ran, the .38 clutched in his trembling hand, though he knew bullets would be useless here. The tunnel stretched ahead, but it wasn't the same tunnel anymore. The walls pulsed with veins of phosphorescent text, fragments of every boxing article ever written, every interview, every casual conversation about that night in 1971, words bleeding through concrete like infection through flesh. You cannot run from words already spoken. The lead entity's voice echoed from everywhere at once, bouncing off surfaces that shouldn't exist. They live in your memory, Marcus. They are part of you now. Marcus's lungs burned as he navigated passages that twisted in directions his mind couldn't map. He understood now why they needed him alive, why 50 years of careful orchestration had led to this moment. Those words Ali had spoken. They weren't just threats or curses. They were instructions, a code that required the right voice, the right witness, the right level of understanding to activate fully. The tunnel opened into a vast chamber that definitely hadn't existed moments ago. Ancient stone walls rose into darkness, covered with carved symbols that hurt to look at directly. At the center stood a massive circular table made of what looked like compressed boxing gloves, thousands of them fused together into a grotesque monument to violence. Around the table sat 12 chairs, 11 occupied by figures Marcus recognized from old photographs, not just the recent victims, but witnesses from that night who'd died decades ago, their deaths carefully hidden, manipulated to look natural. Only one chair remained empty. "You see now," came the leader's voice from behind him. Marcus turned to find the entity reconstituted, its form more stable than before but still wrong in ways that made his vision blur. This has been building for 5 decades. Every person in that room, every witness to Ali's words, every thread of the story carefully gathered. Marcus's grandfather sat in one of the chairs, dead for 30 years but wearing the same suit he'd been buried in. The old man's eyes were empty sockets filled with starlight, but his mouth moved with familiar cadence. "Told you boxing was a dangerous business, boy," his grandfather said. "Didn't know how dangerous until it was too late." "None of us knew," added another voice. Marcus recognized Detective Patricia Voss from the NYPD, who'd supposedly died of cancer in 1987. "We thought we were just doing our jobs that night. Security detail, background checks, routine investigation. Didn't understand we were witnessing Genesis." The lead entity circled the table, its form shifting between human and something Marcus's sanity refused to catalog. Muhammad Ali reached into his deepest pain that night. The loss of his mother, the betrayal of friends, the weight of being reduced to entertainment for people who would never understand his struggle. When he spoke, he didn't just insult Joe Frazier. He cracked reality itself. Marcus kept the gun raised, though his hand shook violently. What did he say? What were the actual words? "You know them," the entity whispered. "They've been burning in your memory for 50 years. You've dreamed them, whispered them in your sleep, felt them crawling through your thoughts every time you looked at your daughter, your grandson." The truth hit Marcus like a physical blow. The words weren't just in his memory. They were alive inside him, growing stronger every year. Every time he'd tried to remember that night, every time he'd pushed the memory away, he'd been feeding them, nurturing them. The deadline, Marcus gasped. "What happens if you don't complete this tonight?" "We fade," the entity admitted. 50 years of borrowed time expires. We return to being what we were, just words in the dark, just echoes of pain and rage with no substance. Then I'll make sure you fade." Marcus raised the gun to his own temple. If he died here, the words died with him, the cycle would end. But his grandfather's voice stopped him cold. "Think about what you're really doing, Marcus. These things, they're not evil, they're just consequences, the natural result of words spoken in anguish. You kill yourself, you don't stop them, you just delay them until they find another way." "Your grandson," Detective Voss added, her starlight eyes boring into him. 11 years old, impressionable, traumatized by his grandfather's mysterious death, the perfect vessel for carrying forward traumatic memory. Marcus felt the trap closing completely around him. Kill himself, and they'd eventually claim Tommy. Speak the words, and they'd become permanently real. Refuse both options, and they'd torture his family across generations until someone broke. The entity extended something that might have been a hand. "Sit, Marcus. Take your place at the table. Speak the words that Muhammad Ali spoke 50 years ago, and end this." Marcus looked at the empty chair, his chair, apparently reserved for 5 decades. Everything he'd learned about investigation, about truth, about justice, crystallized into a single terrible understanding. Some mysteries weren't meant to be solved. Some truths were too dangerous to speak. But as he stared at that chair, Marcus realized he'd been asking the wrong question all along. Not what did Ali say, but why had Ali's words gained such power in the first place? The answer would either save him or damn them all. Marcus approached the empty chair with leaden steps, his mind racing through possibilities that grew darker with each heartbeat. The entity's starlight eyes tracked his movement, hungry and patient, while the assembled dead watched from their eternal seats around the grotesque table. "You think you understand the trap," Marcus said, his voice steadier than he felt. "But you've made one critical error." The lead entity's form rippled with what might have been amusement. "Enlighten us." "You needed me to want the truth, to dig deep enough that I'd uncover the connections myself." Marcus's hand tightened on his gun. "But in doing that, you showed me something you didn't intend." He thought of the timeline he'd constructed in his office, the careful pattern of deaths, the methodical elimination of witnesses. Too methodical, too perfect. The deaths weren't random, and they weren't just to silence witnesses. You were collecting them, building this table, this council, one soul at a time. Marcus felt the pieces clicking together even as his sanity strained against the implications. "But there's a reason you waited until now, until the very last moment of your 50-year deadline." The entity's form began to waver, its careful composure cracking. Around the table, the other dead leaned forward with renewed hunger. "You're not just consequences of Allie's words," Marcus continued. "You're parasites, feeding on the pain, the memory, the trauma of that moment. And like any parasite, you need a living host." His grandfather's corpse spoke with hollow authority. "Sit down, boy. You're making this harder than it needs to be." But Marcus saw through the deception now. "You're not my grandfather. You're wearing his face, speaking with his voice, but you never knew him." He turned to face the entity directly. "My grandfather would never call me boy. He called me champ every single day of my life until he died." The figure wearing his grandfather's face hissed and began to dissolve, its features running like melted wax. Around the table, other disguises started failing, the dead witnesses revealing themselves as hollow shells animated by desperate hunger. "Clever," the lead entity admitted, its voice now coming from multiple throats at once, "but ultimately irrelevant. Truth or lies, we still need those words spoken. We still need completion." Marcus felt his phone vibrating in his pocket. A text message. With shaking hands, he pulled it out, keeping his gun trained on the entity as he glanced at the screen. It was from Rachel. "Dad, weird question, but did you ever tell me about some words from a boxing match? I've been having these dreams, and Tommy says he's been having them too. Same words, over and over. Should I be worried?" The phone slipped from Marcus's nerveless fingers, clattering onto the stone floor. The trap wasn't closing. It had already closed. While he'd been investigating, while he'd been following their carefully laid trail, the entities had been working through the connection that mattered most. The genetic link between grandfather and grandson, the inherited trauma that could carry their influence forward. "You see now," the entity whispered, its form growing more solid, more real, as Marcus's hope crumbled. "We don't need you to speak the words. We never did. Your family already carries them. We just needed you here to witness their activation." Marcus's phone screen flickered to life, showing actual live footage now, not the manufactured images from before. Rachel's car pulled into his driveway, and he watched his daughter and grandson get out, their movements stiff and mechanical. Even from this distance, he could see their lips moving in perfect synchronization, speaking words he couldn't hear but knew with bone-deep certainty. "The words will be spoken," the entity said with finality. "If not by you, then by them. The circle will be completed. We will be made real." Marcus raised his gun toward the entity, then toward himself, then let it fall to his side in defeat. Every option led to the same conclusion. His investigation, his cleverness, his 50 years of carrying this secret, all of it had been orchestrated to lead to this moment of absolute powerlessness. The empty chair seemed to mock him, waiting for surrender that now felt inevitable. Around the table, the false dead began to laugh, a sound like breaking glass and distant thunder that echoed through dimensions Marcus couldn't name. He had solved the mystery, uncovered the truth, followed every lead to its logical conclusion. And in doing so, he had doomed everyone he loved. The entity extended its hand once more. "Sit, Marcus. Watch your legacy unfold."